Well, I mentioned yesterday that it's not just Anthony Albanese who is in a spin on climate change. So too the federal government, and as I said yesterday, Joel Fitzgibbon. In fact, in an address to the National Press Club yesterday, Scott Morrison talked about zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And he wrapped it up in a whole lot of fairly meaningless rhetoric. But of course, on this and on coronavirus, the Prime Minister says the government gets its information from, quote, trusted experts, unquote. Well, the only thing is they are selective about which experts they listen to. Joel Fitzgibbon and Labor have affirmed their commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, now an almost universal consensus, they say. Well, it seems that Labor are in the same climate change hole as the Liberal Party, articulated by the Prime Minister yesterday, and I quote, net zero emissions by 2050. Well, on this program, we talk to the fair dinkum experts. Enter Bjorn Lomborg. We've spoken to him often. He's a world authority on this very issue. Bjorn Lomborg is president of the Copenhagen Consensus and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. His latest book is False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. You can't be more blunt than that. Of the Joe Biden argument that climate change is an existential threat to our communities, our economy, our national security and our environment, Bjorn Lomborg says, quote, Biden's climate alarmism is almost entirely wrong, unquote. Bjorn Lomborg makes the point that Biden wants to spend $644 billion each year on climate policies. And a stack of Australians are amongst a group of 153 signatories who say that Biden could be remembered as the climate president to lead humanity off the cliff edge. In fact, late last month, Mr Morrison lauded Joe Biden's decision to re-enter the Paris Agreement and said there was no longer any question about the need to work towards a zero net emissions future. And our Prime Minister said, I think the Biden administration provides an opportunity to really pursue that with some enthusiasm. May God forbid. For some sanity, let's go to Bjorn Lomborg, who joins us from Copenhagen in Sweden. Bjorn, thank you for your time again and for the clarity of your thoughts. You have said Biden's climate alarmism is almost entirely wrong. Asking people to spend $1,500 every year, you say, is unsustainable, when surveys show that a majority are unwilling to spend even $24 a year on climate. And you say policies like Paris will fix little at a high cost. How do you explain to that?
Well, fundamentally, so Alex, great to see you again. Fundamentally, we need to recognize that climate is a problem, but the way that we're trying to tackle it right now is typically incredibly expensive and will do very little to actually fix the problem. That's a very bad recipe for political success. So as you mentioned, Biden is suggesting to spend $1,500 every year for the next 4 years to do virtually nothing. Yet most people are not willing to spend, as you mentioned, $24. That is not sustainable. If you want a climate policy that will work in the long run, you need to find a way that's sufficiently cost effective that people are actually willing to keep paying. That's why, among all the things that Biden is talking about, we should focus on just one thing. He's talking about spending a lot of money that will do very little good, but we should be spending a lot more on research and development into green energy. Because if we can innovate the price...
Bjorn, just let me go, before we do to that, to this language, though. I find this quite frightening. He says the climate change is an existential threat. Now, the word existential means a threat to our existence. I mean, making economies carbon neutral by 2050, as you say, is costly. And you've cited that New Zealand study to make economies carbon neutral by 2050. It found the average best case cost is 16% of GDP. Now, for America, that's more than $5 trillion a year. For Australia, it'll be $224 billion a year. We're not told any of this, are we?
No, I mean, we're giving the sense that this is possibly even something that we can get rich off. But I don't know if you saw last week, the EU actually admitted that if they don't raise incredibly high carbon protection taxes, basically this could be the death row for European industries. Clearly, this is going to be very costly. And as you mentioned, New Zealand is the only country in the world who's actually asked an independent review of how much is it going to cost them to go carbon neutral by 2050. The answer was 16% of GDP if New Zealand does everything right, which nobody has done so far in climate policies. Typically, that means it'll become twice as expensive.
Absolutely.
But spending, as you said, $240 billion Australian dollars every year by 2050 is unconscionable.
Ridiculous.
And it's very, very hard to imagine that people are going to go along with it. Again, we need to get a sense of proportion. The UN tells us that global warming is a real problem. They tell us that by the 2070s, the cost of global warming will be somewhere between 0.2 and 2% of GDP. That means each of us is going to feel somewhere between 0.2 and 2% less well off. But remember, by then, we're going to be 363% richer. So it'll feel like we'll only be 356% richer. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not an existential problem of the end of the world.
Absolutely. Okay, it will cost us, but the benefit will already gained. The cost will be minimal. Just explain to our viewers about this hurricane argument, because they keep saying, climate change is hurricanes are worse than they've ever been. Global warming produced record instances of hurricanes. Blow a hole in that argument, will you?
Well, look, we believe from theoretical arguments that global warming will make hurricanes slightly fewer, not more as what you typically hear, but also more ferocious. Overall, that actually means that there will be slightly more damage. So global warming is a problem. But again, get a sense of proportion. Most of us heard very much that 2020 was a record-breaking hurricane year. But actually, if you look at the amount of damage from hurricanes around the world, no, it was no such thing. Yes, they ran out of numbers or letters for the hurricanes, but that's because we have satellites, so we can identify a lot of hurricanes that we never saw before just spinning around out in the middle of the Atlantic. The Atlantic was above average, but all other regions were below. Actually, 2020 was one of the weakest hurricane years in satellite history. We don't hear that because we just look at CNN and see, here's the next hurricane, and here's the next hurricane, and here's another hurricane.
I know.
It's very powerful, but it's not real.
But why, Bjorn, why are parliamentarians, A, so alarmist, and B, so ignorant, and creating fear amongst people without reading? We listen to the experts. I don't know which experts they listen to. Why do you think they're so alarmist and so ignorant?
Well, I think fundamentally it's a question about what serves politicians well. Remember, politicians have to get reelected. And basically, global warming is one of those places where you say, that was terrible, everybody applauds. If you say, well, actually, we are doing pretty well, everybody gets really annoyed. Obviously, most politicians are just going to keep telling you, here's a huge problem. Also, it gives politicians the opportunity to say, global warming is terrible, but I can save you from this. Yes. And of course, the reality is they can do no such thing, but only at a very, very high cost. Let's get real about this issue.
Well, the Paris Agreement, I mean, you make the point that by the UN's estimates, if all nations were to live up to their promises, it would reduce global temperatures by less than 0.05 degrees centigrade by 2100, but it would force economies to use less or more expensive energy. And you say there are many studies which show that the drag on the economies is US 1 to 2 trillion lost in GDP every year after 2030. I mean, why aren't we being told this? Bjorn Lomborg tells us governments won't.
Well, I think most people, and certainly most in the know that this is going to be incredibly expensive. And that's also what you're increasingly seeing when governments have committed to net zero and are starting to realize, wait a minute, this is going to be incredibly expensive. That's why we need to have a more honest conversation about saying, if you actually want to fix climate change, you're not going to do this by these incredibly expensive policies because you're going to run out of money and willingness to pay. Okay,
now all our viewers are hearing is about zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Before I let you go tonight, can you make a comment about that? Zero carbon dioxide emissions for Australians by 2050. Bjorn Lomborg.
It's a beautiful argument. It's not going to be possible with today's technology. As Bill Gates point out, we're 2 or 3 dozens technological breakthroughs away from making that happen. So if we want to do this now, it's going to be phenomenally expensive. We're only going to get rich countries on board to do that. And that's no solution, because remember, 3/4 of all emissions in the 21st century will come from China, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. And they're not going to give up their opportunity to pull their people out of poverty. They will want to get economic development rather than cut their carbon emissions. The only way we're going to fix this, the only way we're going to get to net zero, is through innovation. If we can innovate the price of green energy down below fossil fuels, everyone will switch. But if we can't, we will never fix this problem.
Good on you. Good to talk to you, Bjorn, and we'll talk again. Keep in touch. Thank you always for your time and your insights. Very grateful. There he is, Bjorn Lomborg, talking to us all the way from Sweden.